The gunshot that tore through the evening silence brought Marshal Matthew Miller to his feet, rifle already in hand, before the echoes had faded across the wide Montana plains. It was 1876, a year of blood and gold in the West, and in Wolf Creek, death rarely called with a warning. The tall figure moved with purpose across the weathered planks of his porch, eyes scanning the main street. The town was small, barely 20 buildings stretched along a dusty thoroughfare that led to nowhere worth speaking of, but it was his to protect. Evening shadows stretched long across the dirt road as shopkeepers locked up and saloon doors began to swing. Marshal, the voice belonged to young Thomas, the blacksmith's boy, breathless from running. Riders common and fast from the east, one's hurt bad. Matthew squinted toward the horizon where dust clouds rose in the dying light. 3 horses pushing hard. The lead rider slumped precariously in the saddle. "Get Doc Wilson," Matthew ordered, already moving toward the edge of town. The riders approached at a dangerous gallop. As they drew closer, Matthew could see the lead rider was a woman, blood staining her side, her face pale beneath the dust. A man rode alongside, one hand on her saddle to keep her from falling. The third rider followed, constantly looking back over his shoulder. "Help!" The second rider called as they neared. "Ambushed on the trail, she's been shot." Matthew reached them as they pulled up, the woman's horse shuddering with exertion. Her eyes, bright with pain and determination, met his briefly before she swayed. Matthew caught her as she fell from the saddle, her body surprisingly light in his arms. "What happened?" he demanded, carrying her toward Doc Wilson's place. "Stage robbers," the man who'd been riding beside her explained, dismounting quickly. "We were escorting the stage from Silver Ridge. They hit us about 10 miles back. Miss Katherine Winters here took a bullet meant for the driver." The name registered dimly in Matthew's mind. Katherine Winters, the new schoolteacher Wolf Creek had been expecting for weeks. The town council had written to San Francisco for an educated woman to teach their children, and after months of correspondence, she'd agreed to come. Doc Wilson met them at his door, already rolling up his sleeves. "Bring her in, Marshal, quick now." Hours later, Matthew sat on the bench outside the doctor's office, hat in his hands. The 2 men who'd ridden in with Katherine's stage guards hired to escort her safely to Wolf Creek had given their statements and gone to secure rooms at the boarding house. The town had fallen quiet except for the distant piano from the Silver Spoon Saloon. The door opened and Doc Wilson emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth. "She'll live," he said simply. "Bullet went clean through her side, missed anything vital, but she's lost blood. She's awake asking about you." Matthew frowned. "Me, she doesn't know me," the doctor shrugged. "Said she needs to speak with the law. That's you." Inside, Katherine Winters lay on the doctor's examination table, now covered with clean sheets. Her dress had been replaced with one of Mrs. Wilson's nightgowns, and her dark hair lay loose around shoulders too thin for the burden they seemed to carry. Her face, though pale, was striking, not conventionally beautiful perhaps, but with a quiet strength that caught Matthew off guard. Her eyes opened as he approached, revealing a startling shade of green. "Marshal," she said, her voice stronger than he expected. "Thank you for your assistance. Just doing my job, Miss Winters, though I reckon getting shot wasn't in your teaching contract." A small smile touched her lips. "No, it certainly wasn't," she winced as she shifted. "Those men who attacked us weren't ordinary robbers. They knew I was coming." Matthew's attention sharpened. "What makes you say that?" "They called me by name, said to tell Wolf Creek that Blackwell sends his regards." The name hit Matthew like a physical blow. Jacob Blackwell, a name he hadn't heard in 5 years, not since the man had left 3 of Matthew's deputies dead and disappeared into the territories with enough stolen gold to buy himself a small kingdom. "You're certain they said Blackwell?" She nodded. "I wouldn't forget. The man who shot me seemed disappointed when he realized I wasn't dead, said it was just a message, but next time would be different." Matthew paced the small room, mind racing. "Did you know a Jacob Blackwell in San Francisco?" "No." "I've never heard the name before today." Then he's not after you, Matthew said, more to himself than to her. He's sending me a message, using you to do it. Katherine watched him, her eyes too perceptive for comfort. You know this man. It wasn't a question, but Matthew answered anyway. I was the one who nearly caught him after he robbed the territorial bank. He killed 3 good men that day. He stopped pacing, looking down at her. Miss Winters, I think you should return to San Francisco once you're able to travel. Wolf Creek isn't safe for you. Her chin lifted slightly. I signed a contract, Marshal Miller. These children need education and I intend to provide it. I won't be frightened away before I've even begun. You were shot today. And I survived. She held his gaze steadily. I didn't come all this way to turn back at the first sign of trouble. Matthew recognized the steel in her voice. He'd heard it in his own often enough. Still, the thought of Blackwell targeting the schoolteacher to get to him sat like lead in his stomach. We'll discuss this tomorrow, he said finally. You need rest. As he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. Marshal, these children, have they had any schooling at all? The question surprised him. Some. Mrs. Hollister taught them basic reading last winter before her health failed. Town's been looking for a proper teacher ever since. Katherine nodded, as if confirming something to herself. Then I'll begin lessons Monday morning. Please inform the town council. Despite everything, Matthew found himself smiling slightly. Katherine Winters was clearly not a woman accustomed to taking no for an answer. Yes, madam, he said, placing his hat back on his head. I'll spread the word. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a simple one-room building that had served multiple purposes over Wolf Creek's short history. It had been a meeting hall, a church on Sundays, and occasionally, when winter storms made travel impossible, emergency shelter for stranded travelers. Now, whitewashed and fitted with new benches, it awaited the town's first official teacher. 3 days after her arrival, Katherine Winters stood before the building, leaning slightly on a walking stick Doc Wilson had insisted she use. Her wound was healing well, but moving too quickly still brought pain. 23 children of various ages stood in an uncertain cluster before her, eyeing the newcomer with curiosity. Good morning, she said, her voice clear in the morning air. I am Miss Winters, and I'll be your teacher. Let's begin by learning each other's names. Matthew watched from a distance, leaning against the hitching post in front of the general store. He'd taken to patrolling past the schoolhouse regularly, eyes constantly scanning the horizon for trouble. No further word had come from Blackwell, but the threat hung in the air like the promise of a storm. Quite a lady, ain't she? Old Sam Henderson commented, coming to stand beside Matthew. The storekeeper had lived in these parts longer than most, having arrived with the first wave of settlers after the war. Got those youngsters organized quicker than a cavalry drill. Matthew nodded, watching as Katherine directed the children into the building, her movements graceful despite her injury. She's determined, I'll give her that. Heard tell she stood up to those road agents something fierce, Sam said. Jimmy Porter says she actually fired back at them after she was hit, got one in the arm before they rode off. This was news to Matthew. The stage guards hadn't mentioned that detail. That true? Sam shrugged. That's what Jimmy claims he heard from one of those guards. Said she had a little Derringer in her pocket. Regular lady's gun, but she knew how to use it. Matthew filed that information away, his estimation of Katherine Winters rising another notch. Most women from San Francisco society didn't know one end of a gun from the other. Marshal. The call came from down the street. Deputy Frank Jenkins was hurrying toward him, waving a telegram. Wire just came in from Silver Ridge. You'll want to see this. Matthew took the paper, scanning its brief contents. Blackwell spotted north of Helena, stop 3 men killed in bank robbery, stop heading south, possibly your direction, stop territorial authorities notified, stop get Jackson and meet me at the office, Matthew ordered. We need to prepare. For 2 weeks, Wolf Creek held its breath. Matthew organized additional patrols, deputized trusted men, and kept the telegram's contents quiet to avoid panic. Katherine continued her lessons, unaware of the latest news, though she noticed the increased vigilance. "You're expecting trouble," she said one evening, finding Matthew outside the schoolhouse as she locked up. The children had gone home, and the setting sun cast long shadows across the yard. Matthew saw no point in lying. "Blackwell's been spotted, could be heading this way." She absorbed this with remarkable composure. "I see. Should I be concerned for my students' safety? I've got men watching the school during the day, town councils discussing whether to suspend lessons temporarily." Katherine shook her head firmly. "These children have already missed enough education, will continue unless there's immediate danger." She glanced at him, noting the lines of fatigue around his eyes. "You haven't been sleeping." "Part of the job," he replied. They walked together toward the boarding house where she had taken a room. Matthew had insisted on escorting her each evening, though she'd protested that it wasn't necessary. "What kind of man is he?" she asked after a long silence. "This Blackwell," Matthew considered the question. "Smart. Calculating, doesn't act without purpose." He hesitated. "And he holds grudges. 5 years ago I was the one who tracked him down after the robbery. Put a bullet in his leg before he escaped. He won't have forgotten. And you believe I was shot as a message to you?" "I do." Katherine stopped walking, turning to face him directly. "Then perhaps you should tell me why a notorious outlaw would go to such lengths to target you specifically, Marshal, because I suspect there's more to this story than you're sharing." Their eyes met in the gathering dusk. Matthew had faced down armed men without flinching, but something in Katherine's steady gaze made him uncomfortable. "It's complicated," he said finally. "I was shot because of it. I think I deserve the full story." She was right, of course. Matthew glanced around the empty street. "Not here. Come to my office tomorrow after school. I'll explain then." The following day brought rain unusual for the season but welcome to the parched land. By afternoon, the main street had turned to mud, and the children splashed gleefully through puddles as they ran home from school. Katherine arrived at Matthew's office with her skirts muddy to the ankles and a determined expression on her face. Deputy Jenkins tactfully excused himself as she entered, leaving them alone. Matthew gestured to the chair across from his desk. "I appreciate you coming in this weather," he said formally. "I appreciate your willingness to speak plainly," she replied, removing her wet shawl and hanging it near the stove to dry. Matthew poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one before sitting behind his desk. The rain drummed steadily on the roof as he gathered his thoughts. "Jacob Blackwell and I grew up together in Missouri," he began, the words feeling strange after years of silence on the subject. "Same town, same school. His family had money, mine didn't, but we were friends, close as brothers once." Katherine listened silently, her hands wrapped around the warm cup. "We both came west after the war. I'd served with the Union, he with the Confederates. Thought that might drive us apart, but when we met again in Denver, it was like no time had passed." Matthew stared into his coffee. "We worked claims together for a while, then moved on when they played out. Eventually, I took this badge and Jacob, he took a different path." "He became an outlaw," Katherine supplied when Matthew paused. "Not right away. He tried ranching for a spell, lost everything in a bad winter. Tried gambling after that." Matthew's face darkened. "Then came the bank robbery. 5 years ago, the Territorial Bank in Helena was hit. 3 guards killed, 20,000 in gold stolen. I didn't know Jacob was involved until I tracked the gang to their hideout." "What happened?" "I recognized him, hesitated, cost my deputies their lives." The memory still burned. "I wounded him, but he got away, disappeared completely until now." Katherine studied him over the rim of her cup. "You blame yourself for those deaths." "I should have seen what he was becoming." "There were signs. We rarely see the darkness in those we care about until it's too late," she said quietly. "It doesn't make what happened your fault." Matthew looked up, surprised by her insight. Most people in town avoided discussing the incident, treating it as a shameful failure on his part. "You sound like you speak from experience," he observed. A shadow crossed her face. "Perhaps I do." Before he could ask more, gunfire erupted from the direction of the bank. Both of them were on their feet instantly, Katherine wincing as the sudden movement pulled at her healing wound. "Stay here," Matthew ordered, grabbing his rifle and checking his revolver. "Be careful," she called after him as he rushed into the rain. The scene at the bank was chaos. 3 men on horseback were exchanging fire with townspeople who'd taken cover behind wagons and water troughs. Deputy Jenkins lay wounded on the boardwalk, and the bank manager stood in the doorway, blood streaming from a gash on his head. Matthew took position behind a barrel, assessing the situation. One of the riders turned in his direction, and Matthew's blood ran cold as recognition hit him. Jacob Blackwell, older and leaner than he remembered but unmistakable. Their eyes met across the muddy street, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. Then Blackwell smiled, a cold, empty gesture that held no trace of the friend Matthew had once known. "Miller," he called over the din. "Still hiding behind that badge." "It's over, Jacob," Matthew shouted back. "Surrender now." Blackwell's laugh was harsh. "Like hell, this is just the beginning." He fired a shot that splintered the wood next to Matthew's head. "I told you I'd be back. You should have listened." The gunfight intensified. Matthew managed to hit one of Blackwell's men in the shoulder, nearly unseating him. The third rider was trying to secure bags of money to his saddle while maintaining fire. A movement caught Matthew's eye. Katherine was crossing the street toward the wounded deputy, keeping low. Panic surged through him. "Katherine, get back," he yelled, but his voice was lost in the gunfire. Blackwell noticed her too. With deliberate aim, he turned his pistol toward her. Matthew fired desperately, his bullet grazing Blackwell's arm and throwing off his shot. The outlaw's bullet struck the ground inches from Katherine, who had reached Jenkins and was dragging him toward cover. "Brave little schoolteacher," Blackwell called mockingly. "This town sure knows how to pick them." He wheeled his horse around. "We'll finish this another time, Matthew." The 3 riders thundered out of town, taking with them what looked like a substantial portion of the bank's holdings. Matthew wanted to pursue immediately, but couldn't leave the wounded unattended. By the time he'd organized a posse, Blackwell would have a significant head start. Katherine had managed to get Jenkins into the doctor's office. Her dress was stained with his blood, but she worked alongside Doc Wilson with surprising competence. "You shouldn't have risked yourself," Matthew told her later, after Jenkins had been stabilized and the initial crisis had passed. "I couldn't watch a man bleed to death when I could help," she replied simply. Matthew studied her with new eyes. "Where did you learn medical skills like that?" "My father was a doctor in San Francisco. I assisted him often." She looked away. "Until he died." The rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy with clouds. They stood on the doctor's porch, watching as townspeople cleaned up the aftermath of the raid. "Blackwell recognized you," Matthew said. "He singled you out deliberately." Katherine nodded. "I noticed." "It seems your theory about me being a message was correct, which means you're still in danger as long as you stay in Wolf Creek." Matthew turned to face her fully. "I'm asking you officially, as Marshal, to leave town until we capture him." Her eyes flashed. "And I'm refusing officially as the town's teacher. This isn't a game, Katherine. He'll kill you to get to me." "And what message would my running away send to these children?" she countered. "That when trouble comes, you abandon your responsibilities. That fear should dictate your choices." She shook her head firmly. "I won't teach them that lesson." Matthew wanted to argue further but was interrupted by Sam Henderson hurrying toward them. "Marshal, bank manager says they got away with nearly $15,000. Town payroll was in there and most folks' savings." The news hit Matthew hard. Wolf Creek wasn't a wealthy town. Such a loss would devastate many families, potentially kill the town entirely if the mine payroll couldn't be replaced. "We'll get it back," he promised grimly. "I'm organizing a posse now." "I'll come with you," Katherine said. Both men stared at her in astonishment. "Absolutely not," Matthew said flatly. "I'm an excellent rider and I know how to shoot," she insisted. "More importantly, I know these mountains. I studied maps extensively before coming here. It's too dangerous." "It's dangerous for everyone," she countered. But that money represents the future of this town, my students' futures. I have as much right to help recover it as anyone." Matthew was about to refuse again when Sam spoke up unexpectedly. "She's got a point, Marshal. And if Blackwell's targeting her anyway, might be safer with you than left behind unprotected." The logic was questionable at best, but Matthew could see Katherine had already made up her mind. The stubborn set of her jaw reminded him uncomfortably of his own reflection. "Fine," he conceded reluctantly. "But you follow my orders without question. First sign of trouble, you head back." "Understood." "Perfectly," she agreed with suspicious readiness. By dawn, the posse was assembled, 12 men and Katherine, mounted on horses borrowed from the livery. The rain had cleared, but the ground remained muddy, which Matthew counted as an advantage. Tracking would be easier. "They're heading southeast," he told the group, pointing to the clear hoofprints leading out of town. "Likely making for the territorial border. We ride hard, we might catch them before nightfall." Katherine sat her horse confidently, dressed in split riding skirts that had raised eyebrows among the men. She'd explained that proper ladies in San Francisco often rode astride for countryside excursions, a practice that scandalized the more traditional women of Wolf Creek, but made practical sense for their current mission. The trail was clear for the first several hours, following creek beds and game trails through increasingly rugged country. Around midday, they found the remains of a hasty camp, embers still warm, confirming they were closing the gap. "They're getting careless," Deputy Jackson commented as they remounted after a brief rest. Matthew frowned. "Jacob's never careless. Something doesn't feel right." Katherine rode up beside him. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking he wants us to follow. This could be a trap." She considered this, or a distraction. Matthew glanced at her sharply. "What do you mean? If I were planning something larger, I might create a diversion, draw the law enforcement away from my actual target." She met his eyes steadily. "Like drawing Wolf Creek's marshal and most able men away from the town itself." The possibility struck Matthew like a physical blow. It was exactly the kind of strategy Jacob would employ. "Jackson," he called. "Take 3 men, head back to town. The rest of us continue." "You think she's right?" Jackson asked quietly. "I think we can't afford to be wrong," Matthew replied. "Go, now." As Jackson's group departed, the remaining posse continued tracking. The terrain grew steeper, forcing them to dismount and lead their horses through rocky passages. By late afternoon, they reached a narrow canyon where the tracks suddenly split, one set continuing southeast, the other veering sharply west. "They've separated," Tom Phillips, a local rancher, observed. "Which do we follow?" Matthew studied both sets of tracks carefully. The westward trail showed 3 horses, while the southeastern path showed only 2. "Blackwell's going west," he said with certainty. "He's split the money, sending his men as decoys while he takes a different route." "How can you be sure?" someone asked. Matthew straightened. "Because west leads to Red Rock Pass. Jacob and I used that route years ago when we were prospecting. He knows I remember." "It's a message," Katherine said softly. "He wants you to follow him specifically?" Matthew nodded grimly, "Which is exactly what I intend to do." "The rest of you follow the other trail. If you catch those men, hold them for the territorial authorities. Don't take unnecessary risks." The men exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with splitting their forces further. "Marshal, with respect, that sounds like walking into a trap," Phillips said. "It probably is," Matthew agreed. "But Blackwell's business is with me. No sense risking all your lives." "I'm coming with you," Katherine stated firmly. Matthew started to object, but she cut him off. "Before you waste breath arguing, consider that I'm the one person he might not shoot on sight. He's had 2 opportunities to kill me and hasn't. That might be useful. Or it might get you killed for real this time. That's my risk to take." The men watched this exchange with expressions ranging from shock to grudging respect. Finally, Matthew nodded curtly. "Stay behind me, keep your head down, and if I tell you to run, you run." "Clear, Crystal," she replied, checking the small derringer concealed in her pocket. The posse separated, leaving Matthew and Katherine to follow Blackwell's trail westward. They rode in silence for a time, each lost in their own thoughts as the landscape changed around them. Pine forests gave way to rocky terrain as they climbed toward Red Rock Pass, named for the distinctive ruddy cliffs that framed the narrow passage through the mountains. "You loved him once, didn't you?" Katherine asked suddenly. "Not just as a friend, he was family to you." Matthew didn't answer immediately, surprised by her perception. "We were closer than brothers," he admitted finally. "After my parents died, his family took me in for a time. His father taught us both to shoot, to ride. His mother made sure I finished school." The memories were painful now, tainted by what had come after. "I would have died for him once. And now I'll stop him, however necessary." They reached the entrance to the pass as the sun began to sink behind the mountains. The trail narrowed, forcing them to ride single file between towering red rock walls. Matthew's senses were on high alert, every instinct telling him they were riding into danger. "This is too perfect a place for an ambush," he said softly. "We should leave the horses, continue on foot." They dismounted, securing their horses to a scrub pine. Matthew checked his rifle and revolver while Katherine adjusted her skirts for easier movement. "Stay close," he instructed, "and keep your eyes up. He could be watching from above." They moved cautiously through the pass, staying close to the cliff walls where shadows offered some concealment. The silence was unnatural, no birds, no rustling of small animals. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. 100 yards in, Matthew spotted something ahead, a horse, tethered similar to their own. Beyond it, the pass opened into a small clearing surrounded by rock formations that resembled broken teeth against the darkening sky. Matthew motioned for Katherine to stay back while he crept forward to investigate. The horse carried saddlebags that bulged with what he assumed was part of the stolen money, but no sign of Blackwell himself. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come." The voice came from above and behind them. Matthew whirled, pushing Katherine behind him as he raised his rifle. Jacob Blackwell stood on a rock ledge 20 feet above, rifle resting casually against his shoulder. "Took you long enough, Matthew," Blackwell continued, his voice eerily conversational. "Though I see you brought the schoolteacher, that's unexpected, dangerous work for a lady." "It's over, Jacob," Matthew called up. "The territorial authorities know you're here. There's no escape this time," Blackwell laughed. "Always so righteous, that badge hasn't changed you a bit." He shifted his gaze to Katherine. "What about you, Miss Winters? Has he told you who he really is? What he did?" "Don't listen to him," Matthew warned her. "Oh, but she should," Blackwell insisted. "She should know that the Honorable Marshal Miller was once the best confidence man west of the Mississippi. That before he pinned on that star, he could separate a man from his money faster than you could blink." Katherine's eyes widened slightly, but she remained silent. "Ancient history," Matthew replied tightly. "People change." "Do they?" Blackwell's voice hardened. "You didn't change, Matthew. You just switched sides when it became convenient. When Clara died, you needed someone to blame besides yourself." The name hit Matthew like a physical blow. "Don't you dare speak her name." "Why not? She was my sister, my twin." Blackwell's face contorted with old pain. "She loved you, followed you into this God-forsaken wilderness because you promised her a better life. And when she died in that blizzard, you couldn't face what you'd done." "That's not how it happened," Matthew gritted out. "No, you left her alone at that cabin while you went for supplies. 3 days in a blizzard and you couldn't find your way back to her. She froze to death waiting for you." Katherine glanced between them, understanding dawning in her eyes. "I tried to get back," Matthew said, his voice rough with remembered anguish. "I nearly died myself trying to reach her." "Not good enough," Blackwell snarled. "And then you had the gall to put on that badge to pretend you were some kind of hero. To hunt me down when all I did was take what the world owed me after everything it had taken from me. You killed innocent people, Jacob." "There are no innocent people," Blackwell replied coldly. "Just those who haven't been tested yet." He raised his rifle. "I'm tired of waiting for you to pay your debt," Time's up, Katherine stepped forward suddenly. Mr. Blackwell, wait. Both men looked at her in surprise. You don't know me, she continued, her voice steady despite the danger, but I understand loss. My father was murdered by men he trusted. I know how grief can consume you, turn to rage so powerful it feels like the only way to breathe is to make others suffer too. Blackwell stared at her, momentarily thrown by her directness. But it doesn't work, she pressed on. The rage just grows, feeding on itself. You can kill him today, but it won't bring Clara back. It won't ease your pain. Pretty words from a schoolteacher, Blackwell said, but his rifle barrel had lowered slightly. Not just words, truth. She took another step forward, ignoring Matthew's attempt to pull her back. What would Clara want? For you to die in this pass, shot down like a rabid dog, or for you to find some kind of peace? For a long moment, no one moved. Something flickered across Blackwell's face, doubt, perhaps, or a memory of who he had once been. Then his expression hardened again. Nice try, he said, raising the rifle once more. But Clara would want justice. 3 shots rang out in rapid succession. Matthew lunged for Katherine, knocking her to the ground as he fired upward. Blackwell returned fire, his bullet striking rock inches from Matthew's head. The third shot came from further up the pass, one of Blackwell's men, previously hidden. Run, Matthew shouted at Katherine, pushing her toward cover behind a boulder. She scrambled away as Matthew laid down covering fire. Blackwell ducked behind the rock ledge, then reappeared at a different position, firing again. The bullet tore through Matthew's sleeve, grazing his arm. The second outlaw was moving into a better position, trying to flank them. Katherine, rather than fleeing as instructed, had drawn her derringer and was watching the man's approach. Katherine, get out of here, Matthew yelled, firing again at Blackwell. And leave you outnumbered? I think not, she called back, her voice remarkably calm. The flanking outlaw spotted her and raised his pistol. Katherine fired first, her small derringer lacking power but finding its mark in the man's shoulder. He stumbled, his own shot going wild, and Matthew took advantage of the moment to put a rifle round into the man's leg. Blackwell, seeing his advantage disappearing, emerged fully from cover, firing rapidly as he descended from the ledge. Matthew felt a bullet tear through his side, the pain white-hot and immediate. He staggered but remained upright, returning fire until his rifle clicked empty. In the sudden silence, they faced each other across 20 feet of rocky ground, Matthew wounded but standing, Blackwell apparently unharmed but also out of ammunition, his pistol pointed uselessly. Looks like we have a problem, Blackwell said with a cold smile, drawing a long knife from his boot. Just like old times, you never could remember to count your shots. Matthew drew his hunting knife, aware that blood was soaking his shirt. The wound was bad but not immediately fatal if he could end this quickly. Jacob, don't do this, he said, his voice steady despite the pain. It doesn't have to end this way. Yes, it does. Blackwell advanced slowly, the knife gleaming in the last light of day. It's been heading this way for 5 years. They circled each other warily. Matthew knew his strength was ebbing with each heartbeat that pushed more blood from his wound. Blackwell was fresh, uninjured, and had always been the better knife fighter. Katherine had disappeared from view. Matthew hoped she'd had the sense to run to get help. His vision blurred momentarily and Blackwell saw the weakness, lunging forward. Matthew parried the first strike, their blades scraping against each other with a metallic screech. The second attack came faster, slicing across Matthew's forearm. The third nearly found his throat before he managed to deflect it. You're slowing down, Matthew, Blackwell taunted. Losing too much blood, it'll be over soon. Matthew knew he was right. Each movement was becoming harder, his reactions dulling as shock set in. He feinted left, then drove forward in a desperate attack that Blackwell easily avoided. I'm almost disappointed, Blackwell said, circling again. I expected more of a fight. I'm sorry, Jacob, Matthew gasped. Sorry about Clara, sorry I couldn't save her. Something flickered in Blackwell's eyes, pain, confusion, a moment of hesitation. The shot came from behind a rock formation to the left. Katherine, having circled around, fired the second chamber of her derringer. The tiny bullet struck Blackwell's shoulder, not a serious wound but enough to throw him off balance. He cursed, turning toward this new threat. Matthew seized the moment, lunging forward and driving his knife into Blackwell's side. The outlaw gasped, his own knife slashing wildly and catching Matthew across the chest. They fell together, grappling in the dirt and stones. Blackwell was stronger, rolling on top and raising his knife for a killing blow. Matthew, with the last of his strength, caught the other man's wrist, holding the blade inches from his throat. "Just die," Blackwell hissed, his face contorted with hatred and pain. "Just die like she did." Matthew felt his grip weakening, the knife edge inching closer to his throat. Then suddenly, Blackwell's weight was gone, thrown sideways by Katherine, who had hurled herself bodily against him. They tumbled across the rocky ground, Blackwell's knife skittering away. Katherine landed hard, the breath knocked from her as Blackwell struggled to rise. He reached for the fallen knife, fingers closing around the handle. The final shot came from the entrance to the clearing. Deputy Jackson, returned from town with reinforcements, fired with deadly accuracy. Blackwell jerked as the bullet struck him in the chest, then slowly collapsed. "Marshal," Jackson called, rushing forward with two other men. "God Almighty, we thought we were too late." Matthew couldn't answer, darkness crowding the edges of his vision. He was vaguely aware of Katherine kneeling beside him, pressing something against his bleeding side. "Stay with me," she was saying, her voice seeming to come from very far away. "Matthew, stay with me. You're not done yet." The world faded to black. Matthew drifted in and out of consciousness for what seemed like eternity. Fragments of memory and dream intermingled: Clara's face in the snowstorm, Jacob as a young man laughing by a campfire, Katherine's voice reading something he couldn't quite understand. Pain came in waves, sometimes receding to a dull throb, other times flaring with such intensity that he would have screamed if he'd had the strength. When awareness finally returned fully, he was in Doc Wilson's back room, lying on a bed with clean sheets that smelled faintly of lye soap. Sunlight filtered through curtained windows, casting patterns across a simple wooden floor. His side and chest were heavily bandaged, and the simple act of breathing caused discomfort. "Welcome back," Katherine's voice said softly from beside him. He turned his head slowly to find her seated in a chair pulled close to the bed. She looked tired, dark circles beneath her eyes, but she smiled when their gazes met. "How long?" he managed, his voice a rough whisper. "4 days," she answered, reaching for a cup of water and holding it to his lips. "Doc wasn't sure you'd make it. You lost a great deal of blood." Matthew drank gratefully, the cool water soothing his parched throat. "Blackwell, dead," she confirmed. "The money was recovered." His remaining men were captured by the other half of the posse. Matthew closed his eyes briefly, a complex wave of emotions washing through him: relief, grief, a strange emptiness. Jacob was gone. The threat had ended, but so had any chance of reconciliation, of understanding, of forgiveness. "You saved my life," he said finally, opening his eyes to look at her again. "We saved each other," she corrected gently. "Though I believe Deputy Jackson deserves the final credit, you should have run when I told you to." A spark of stubbornness lit her eyes. "You're not my marshal when it comes to matters of life and death. I make my own decisions." Despite everything, he found himself smiling weakly. "So I've noticed." A comfortable silence fell between them. Katherine adjusted his blanket unnecessarily, her movements betraying a certain nervousness that hadn't been present before. "He told the truth, didn't he?" she said finally. "About your past." Matthew hesitated, then nodded once. "Some of it. I wasn't always on the right side of the law. After the war, times were hard. I did things I'm not proud of. And Clara?" His sister? Pain that had nothing to do with his physical wounds tightened Matthew's chest. "We were to be married. She died during a blizzard while I was away getting supplies for the winter. I tried to get back to her." His voice faltered. "Jacob never believed that. He thought I abandoned her." Katherine's hand found his, her touch warm and surprisingly strong. "I believe you," she said simply. Those 3 words, spoken with such quiet certainty, broke something inside Matthew that had been frozen for years. Tears burned behind his eyes and he turned his face away, trying to maintain control. "It's all right," Katherine said softly. "You've earned them, those tears. After all this time, you've earned the right to grieve." The gentle permission undid him completely. For the first time since Clara's death, since the day he'd found her frozen body in that lonely cabin, Matthew wept openly. Silent tears at first, then deep, racking sobs that pulled at his wounds and left him gasping. Katherine simply held his hand through it all, offering tissues without judgment when he finally composed himself. "I'm sorry," he said roughly, embarrassed by the display. "Don't be," she replied. "Some wounds can't heal until they're properly cleaned." Matthew studied her face, seeing compassion but no pity, a distinction he deeply appreciated. "You're not what I expected, Katherine Winters." "Is that a compliment, Marshal Miller?" "Definitely," he confirmed, feeling more at peace than he had in years despite his injuries. "Though I'm not sure Wolf Creek deserves a schoolteacher quite as formidable as you've proven to be," she laughed, the sound brightening the small room. "Well, they're stuck with me now. I've signed a 2-year contract and I intend to honor it." "I'm glad," Matthew said, surprising himself with how deeply he meant it. Recovery was slow but steady. By the 2nd week, Matthew could sit up without assistance. By the 3rd, he was taking short walks around Doc Wilson's house, gradually rebuilding his strength. Throughout this time, Katherine visited daily, first reading to him from books she'd brought for the school, then engaging him in conversations that ranged from literature to politics to their respective histories. He learned that her father had indeed been a prominent doctor in San Francisco, murdered by business associates who wanted his property. Katherine had been teaching at a small women's college when the opportunity in Wolf Creek presented itself, a chance for a fresh start away from painful memories. In turn, he shared more about his own past, his childhood in Missouri, the war years that had hardened him, the period afterward when he and Jacob had drifted through mining camps and frontier towns, always searching for the next opportunity. He spoke of Clara too, haltingly at first, then with increasing ease as Katherine's gentle questions helped him separate fond memories from the tragedy of her loss. "You loved her very much," Katherine observed one evening as they sat on Doc Wilson's porch watching the sunset. "I did," Matthew agreed. "But Jacob was right about one thing. I did bring her west because I promised her a better life, a promise I couldn't keep." "Life offers no guarantees," Katherine said thoughtfully. "We make choices based on the best information we have at the time. Sometimes they lead to joy, sometimes to sorrow. The only true failure is refusing to keep living afterward." Matthew glanced at her, struck once again by her wisdom. "Is that why you came to Wolf Creek, to keep living?" She smiled slightly. "Perhaps. Though I'll admit, being shot upon arrival wasn't part of my plan for a fresh start. Wolf Creek has a way of surprising folks," Matthew said, returning her smile. "Not always pleasantly." A month after the confrontation in Reed Rock Pass, Matthew returned to his duties as marshal. The town welcomed him back with a quiet celebration at the Silver Spoon Saloon, nothing elaborate, but heartfelt in the way of frontier communities that understood the value of good law enforcement. Life settled into a new pattern. Matthew's morning rounds often took him past the schoolhouse, where Katherine could be seen through the windows instructing her students with passionate enthusiasm. Sometimes their eyes would meet briefly as he passed, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They began taking Sunday walks together after church, strolling through town or along the creek that gave Wolf Creek its name. These outings raised eyebrows and sparked speculation, but neither of them paid much attention to the gossip. "Mrs. Henderson asked me today if we were courting," Katherine mentioned during one such walk in early autumn. The trees were beginning to turn, splashing the hillsides with gold and crimson. Matthew nearly tripped over a root. "Did she now? And what did you tell her?" "I said I wasn't entirely sure," Katherine replied with refreshing honesty. Are we courting, Marshal Miller? He stopped walking, turning to face her directly. The sunlight caught in her hair, highlighting strands of copper among the brown. Would you like to be? I would, she answered without hesitation. Very much. Even knowing everything you know about me, my past, especially knowing that, she said firmly. You've faced your demons, Matthew. That counts for more than never having had any. He took her hand, his calloused fingers enfolding her smaller ones. Then yes, Miss Winters, I believe we are courting. Her smile was bright enough to rival the autumn sun. Good. That will make Mrs. Henderson very happy. She has quite a substantial bet placed on us in the town pool. There's a betting pool? Matthew asked, horrified. Katherine laughed. Welcome to small-town life, Marshal. Nothing goes unnoticed. Winter came early that year, blanketing Wolf Creek in snow by late November. The memories that once would have tormented Matthew of another winter, another woman lost in the snow, seemed less sharp now, tempered by time and by Katherine's steadying presence in his life. They celebrated Christmas together, joining the town gathering in the schoolhouse where the children performed a pageant under Katherine's direction. Afterward, in the privacy of his small house, Matthew gave her a gift he'd commissioned from a silversmith in Helena, a delicate pendant in the shape of a book, with her initials engraved on the cover. It's beautiful, she breathed as he fastened it around her neck. I have another gift, he said nervously, though it's more of a question, really. She looked up at him expectantly. I know we haven't been courting long, he began, and I understand if you think it's too soon, but I've learned that life doesn't always give us as much time as we think we have. He took a deep breath. Katherine Winters, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Her eyes widened, then filled with tears that sparkled in the lamplight. For a terrible moment, Matthew thought he'd misjudged everything. Yes, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, I will marry you, Matthew Miller. He pulled her into his arms, his heart feeling too large for his chest. I promise to do everything in my power to make you happy, he whispered against her hair. You already have, she replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. They were married in the spring when the wildflowers covered the hills and the creek ran high with snowmelt. The entire town turned out for the celebration, which lasted well into the night. Even Mrs. Henderson, who had won a considerable sum in the betting pool, admitted that she'd never seen a more perfectly matched pair. Katherine continued teaching, refusing to relinquish her position despite traditional expectations that she would retire to domestic life. Matthew supported her decision completely, proud of the difference she was making in their community. The children are improving remarkably, Reverend Taylor commented one Sunday after service. Young Jimmy Parker is actually reading now, which his mother thought would never happen. Katherine has a gift, Matthew agreed, watching as his wife organized the children for a nature walk. She sees potential where others don't. Rather like she did with you, the Reverend observed with a knowing smile. Matthew couldn't disagree. 2 years passed peacefully. Wolf Creek grew modestly, adding a second saloon and a proper hotel to accommodate increased traffic from the expanding railroad. Matthew's reputation as a fair but uncompromising lawman spread throughout the territory, while Katherine's school became known for its progressive teaching methods and exceptional results. In the winter of 1878, Katherine gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Clara Elizabeth Miller. Matthew held the tiny bundle with trembling hands, overcome by a love so fierce it left him breathless. She's perfect, he whispered, watching as the infant wrapped her tiny fingers around his much larger one. She is, Katherine agreed, tired but radiant. Though I suspect she'll be as stubborn as both her parents combined. Matthew laughed softly. God help us all if that's true. As he gazed at his wife and daughter, Matthew reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment, the losses and mistakes, the hard lessons and unexpected second chances. 5 years ago, he couldn't have imagined such happiness would be possible for him again. What are you thinking? Katherine asked, noting his contemplative expression. I'm thinking about paths, he replied. About how sometimes the most painful ones lead to places we never expected to find. She smiled, understanding as she always did. And sometimes where we end up is exactly where we were meant to be all along. Matthew nodded, placing a gentle kiss on his daughter's forehead before leaning down to kiss his wife. "Home," he said simply. "I'm finally home." Outside, snow began to fall softly on Wolf Creek, covering the town in pristine white that promised new beginnings with the coming spring.